Hello everybody. It is January 3rd, 2025 here in the United States of America, and oh boy has it been an interesting morning. I made the mistake of, when I woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning to use the restroom, I made the mistake of looking at my phone, and then, well, I didn't get much sleep after that because the first thing I saw when I opened up Twitter was taking place within Venezuela. Now, for those of you who might not be aware, which I'm sure there's very few that have probably not heard about what took place, the United States launched a military operation into Caracas to capture President Nicolas Maduro, and the operation was apparently successful, and he is being brought back to New York City and indicted on various charges, including drug conspiracy to traffic drugs, terrorism, and several other major charges. Now, this operation included airstrikes, missile strikes from helicopters. I saw videos of transport helicopters dropping in special forces, and then apparently those special forces apprehended Maduro and brought him back aboard one of the helicopters and left with him while sustaining no casualties, or so we're told. Apparently there was damage to one of the helicopters, but no one was killed. So apparently, despite what was the lack of air defense, we actually saw in the videos, apparently one of the helicopters was damaged by gunfire, but the entire operation seems to have gone relatively smoothly. Now, I'm assuming there was some cooperation on the ground from elements of Venezuela's armed forces, which seem to have been taken completely by surprise. And now many of these helicopters easily could have been downed by the various air defense systems that were supplied by Russia and China, but either the military purposefully stood down and didn't take out these helicopters, or they were taken by such a surprise that they didn't have the chance to man any of these weapon systems. Now, what actually took place is hard to really know. There's a lot of different theories out there. Some people are saying that Maduro struck a deal to leave the country, but I don't think he would strike a deal to have himself extradited and brought up on criminal charges in New York. If Maduro had struck some kind of deal to leave the country, well, he would have been allowed to flee to Russia. That's not what took place. I would say he was captured forcefully by United States forces. Now, whether or not some high-ranking members of his government were cooperating with the United States to actually take power for themselves and implement some kind of deal with the United States moving forward, it's hard to say at this point whether power will rest in the hands of the party that Nicolas Maduro belonged to, the power base that he was already a part of, or the opposition groups. Let's just wait and see what happens. Now, many people are up in arms about this, and understandably so. Venezuela is a sovereign power. Now, whether or not Nicolas Maduro was the legally elected president of Venezuela, I think that's sort of a moot point. He was the one holding the power, so whether or not he was legitimately elected or not, it doesn't really matter. The real leader of a country is whoever holds the reins of power at any given time. Elections are just kind of formalities. It really comes down to who's wielding power and who has the monopoly on violence within the state. At the end of the day, whoever holds that is the legitimate leader of whatever country they are currently in charge of. I'm a realist when it comes to that, and I don't consider somebody not the leader of a country just because their path to power wasn't sufficiently democratic. Let's be real here. Who holds the power is who leads the country. Now, Nicolas Maduro, by all accounts, is the one that held power within the country, despite what opposition groups were claiming. Now, many people are saying this was an illegal operation. It shouldn't have taken place. It's a sign of U.S. imperialism. I get it. A lot of people aren't happy about what happened, but I think people need to be realistic about things. As U.S. hegemony recedes and the world moves back towards a multipolar way of being, where the world's great powers have their own spheres of influence and are generally the ones that call the shots within those respective spheres of influence, they are going to aggressively defend what they see as their interests within these spheres of influence. This is what the multipolar world is going to look like. It's not going to be a bunch of people holding hands and singing Kumbaya and obeying international law. The world's great powers, specifically the ones that are armed with nuclear weapons, have large economies and large militaries, are generally going to do what they want when it comes to defending their interests. I think international law and the UN, or going to the UN, are just formalities, motions that countries are going to go through to make what they do appear legitimate on the world stage. It's mainly for show and for public opinion, and to find approval within population bases they need to find approval in. They don't want to appear as if they're acting too rogue, but at the end of the day, ultimately, Russia, China, the United States, to a degree India, Japan, and the EU are going to do whatever they want. It's just the way the world works. I know people don't want to hear that. I know there's a lot of freedom fighters and people that are very pro-sovereignty who aren't going to like that. They're not going to like the way the world works. But unfortunately, if, say, you have and I'm not saying this as somebody who's like a neocon or anything. I think neocons, generally speaking, have very poor strategy when it comes to foreign policy. They get the United States involved in conflicts that they don't need to be involved in. I think their way of looking at the world is very unrealistic and foolish. I am not a neocon, and I'm not an advocate for useless and pointless foreign intervention, but I am a realist, and I am of the understanding, or I have the understanding, that the world's great powers are always going to act in a very certain way to safeguard what they see as their interests at any given moment. That's just the way the world is, whether anybody likes it or not. So if you have a country who's a small regional power next to a much larger power, where they're within their respective sphere of influence, it's in their best interest to play ball with that country and conduct themselves very intelligently when it comes to their foreign policy. I think it's pretty obvious now, given what happened in Venezuela, that Russia and China were not going to come to its rescue. It's firmly within America's sphere of influence. Same reason why I think ultimately Ukraine will be defeated militarily and forced to make a series of concessions that they don't like to Russia at the end of this war. Because ultimately, I think the other world's powers aren't going to directly intervene in Ukraine any more than they already are. At least not enough to actually bring about any kind of military defeat of Russia. And also with Taiwan, I think most people are of the understanding that if China really wanted to take Taiwan by force, the U.S. probably would not act in any meaningful way to stop it. Although I think there's a lot of posturing, a lot of hoping that America's posturing will prevent the Chinese from acting because they don't want a war either. I think ultimately, at the end of the day, if the Chinese were to seize Taiwan by force, there's not much the United States would do to stop it. I could be wrong, but I think Pete Hegseth is enough of a realist when it comes to military conflict to understand that this just won't work, and it wouldn't be a sustainable military operation, especially not right on China's border. But anyways, the point I'm making here is the world's great powers are going to do whatever they see fit in their own sphere of influence. That's how the multipolar world is going to break down. Now, I think it's in whatever whatever zone of influence is occupied by a specific world power. I think it's in that world power's best interests to make all the smaller countries within the region generally happy with its presence. I think they want to be as beneficial as possible to facilitate trade and to make conflict less likely. Just to bring about stability and peace. It's beneficial to have a peaceful region. Whatever country is rolling over, whatever region of the planet is rolling over, to have that region be relatively peaceful and conflict-free is in that country's best interests. Now, as far as the casus belli, the reason the United States gave for intervening in Venezuela, I think a lot of it is just, it's for show. I see a lot of people arguing about, well, it's for oil, it's because of the drug shipments from Venezuela. It's because of just U.S. imperialism, and it just wants resources and rare earths, and there's just various different reasons given for what just took place. And I think it just comes down to just the great geopolitical game that nations have always played. Venezuela is viewed as being firmly in America's sphere of influence. The American sphere of influence is North and South America. Now, I know a lot of countries in North and South America might not like that. I'm not saying that I'm cheering for this. I'm not saying that I'm advocating for this policy. Just being a realist here, America is by far the most powerful country in this hemisphere. It exists virtually unopposed. It does what it wants virtually unopposed in this region of the world. There's not a great power within North and South America that could actively challenge the United States, and no one has nuclear weapons. So the United States is going to behave as it sees fit to secure its interests. Now, why I think Venezuela was targeted specifically is, yes, there's a long history with Maduro. I don't really care that Maduro is a socialist. That doesn't really matter. That doesn't mean anything to me. I don't know if Maduro was actually involved in drug trafficking, but Maduro was a staunch ally of Russia and China, two of the other world's great leading powers. Now, Venezuela could have functioned, I would say, as some kind of outpost, some kind of staging area for potential military operations if there was some kind of conflict between the United States, Russia, and China. I think the United States didn't want to tolerate having any kind of nation exist within its sphere of influence that could be firmly allied with one of its potential adversaries. I think it wants every country within North and South America to be firmly on the side of the United States of America and not a staging ground for any kind of activity that could be detrimental to U.S. foreign policy in the future. I'm not saying that this is my position. I am saying that this is likely the position of the United States government and how any great power in the position of the United States would look at things. This is why there's a conflict in Ukraine. Russia saw a threat to its interests on its border within Ukraine, and the potential of Ukraine joining NATO was not something Russia would stomach from a strategic point of view, so it acted. I think that's also Russia acted in Georgia for similar reasons and acted in Chechnya for similar reasons. Russia's not behaving in any kind of abnormal way as far as great powers go. It's why China, I think, is only going to tolerate so much interference in Taiwan. Now, if long-range offensive weapon systems are placed in Taiwan, I'd say that would probably be the end of the line for China's patience on Taiwan. China wouldn't tolerate having an outpost of Western weaponry or offensive military capability right off of its coast. Again, in the United States, is not going to tolerate that within, Venezuela's, sure, it's across the Caribbean, but it's close enough to the U.S. that they would consider it its backyard, like it or not. Also, too, as far as Mexico goes, the fact that Mexican drug cartels are operating freely on the southern border, I suspect that that is going to be the next target of some kind of major operation. Again, because I don't see the United States as a great power tolerating that for much longer. If the Mexican government can't get this under control, then the U.S. will step in and intervene themselves. But ultimately, the point I'm making here is, as U.S. hegemony recedes and the world shifts over to having different spheres of influence dominated by the world's great powers and no longer dominated by one single power, then I think things like this, conflicts like this, are going to be inevitable and are going to be an unfortunate reality of the world moving forward, because the great game of geopolitics doesn't stop just because someone is no longer playing hegemon. Now, while I think it's beneficial that the U.S. is no longer the world's hegemon, I think it's beneficial for the U.S. specifically because I think we're just overextended and can't afford it, and the citizenry of the country no longer is interested in enforcing it. The world is going to make some shifts away from that, and things are going to change pretty rapidly. I think that smaller nations, less powerful nations, moving forward are going to have to start playing nice with their larger neighbors to avoid similar fates. I think there's going to be, I wouldn't say a cold war between the world's major powers, but you'll see proxy conflicts still happen. I think there'll be some kind of understanding between the world's main powers that direct conflict between them, especially if they're armed with nuclear weapons, is no longer acceptable. That moving forward, that's not something that will happen, but I do expect interference to still happen within each country's respective sphere of influence, but kept to like a minimal degree, and something that would just be a nuisance, I would say. But anyways, that's really all I wanted to talk about today. We'll see what things look like moving forward. I will see what Maduro is actually charged with and what kind of sentence he gets, and what actually happens in Venezuela now that there's a power vacuum. Who takes his place? Who's going to run the country moving forward? What kind of deal are they going to make with the United States? What will this do? What kind of standard and precedent is this going to set moving forward within international relations? What would be any potential future military operations taking place in Mexico? Anything could happen. We'll see. But as I mentioned before, just to make this clear, I am not making this video to cheer this on. I'm not rooting for this. I'm not saying that this should have happened. I'm not saying that this was the right course of action to take. I am a political realist, and this was unavoidable, and this was something that was always going to take place because it was happening in America's sphere of influence, and that this is something that's been common throughout history and is probably going to keep happening as the world is basically carved up and dominated by the major powers that currently exist. That's what's going to replace U.S. hegemony. It's going to be local hegemony, and sometimes that might get ugly, but unfortunately that's just the way the world works. But anyways, it's really all I wanted to talk about today. I'll be back this evening with a live stream around 8 o'clock, I believe, and maybe I'll touch upon this some more. So if anyone would like to come back, please feel free to do so. If you enjoyed this content, please subscribe to this channel, give this video a like, and I will see everybody next time.